This is your captain speaking.
The cologne hit her first. Not the sight of his name on the passenger manifest. Not the confirmation number tied to her own joint credit card. Not even the second name listed beside his in-seat 1A and 1B, a name she had never heard spoken aloud in her home but had seen twice now in the recent call log on a phone that wasn't hers to look at. Yet she had looked anyway. No, what cut deepest was the cologne. She smelled it the moment she stepped through the forward galley to greet her senior flight attendant. And she stopped walking. Just for a breath. Just for one. It was his. The same amber and cedar one she had bought him for their 7th anniversary, the one he sprayed twice every single morning standing in their bathroom mirror with his chin tilted up, looking at his reflection like he was making himself a promise. The scent was drifting softly from behind the first-class partition curtain, faint and completely unmistakable, and Imara Osibansu, Captain Imara Osibansu, 11 years licensed, 7 as a commercial aircraft commander, stood in that galley and let the smell arrive in her chest the way certain truths arrive, quietly, completely, with nowhere left to go. Then she breathed out, adjusted the sleeve of her uniform jacket so the gold stripe sat exactly where it belonged, and walked back through the cockpit door. She had a flight to run. Before this story goes any further, if you are finding this channel for the first time, you are exactly where you need to be. If what you just heard already has your attention, go ahead and hit subscribe right now and drop a comment below. I want to know, honestly, would you have kept your composure the way this woman did? Or would that curtain have been pulled back before the boarding door was even sealed? Be honest with us in the comments. Because what Imara Osibansu did next, the choice she made to sit down in that cockpit and strap in and begin her pre-flight sequence like she hadn't. T just smelled her husband's cologne drifting from behind a curtain where another woman sat beside him. That choice is the spine of this entire story. Let's go. Imara had grown up in Silver Spring, Maryland, the second daughter of a Ghanaian father who repaired electronics from a shop on Fenton Street and a mother who taught middle school science and believed, above all earthly things, in the value of doing exactly what you said you were going to do. Not more, not less. Exactly that. Her father used to say that a man who finishes what he starts has already won half of every argument life will ever put in front of him. Imara had taken that philosophy and applied it to every dimension of her existence, with a thoroughness that surprised most people who met her and surprised none of the people who knew her well. She had her pilot's license at 19. Her commercial certification came at 23. The same year her mother was diagnosed with a condition that required careful management and a lot of appointments. Imara attended every single one she could, built her hours in the evenings and on weekends, and did not complain about the schedule to a single living person. Her captain's stripes arrived at 36. People who flew with her regularly described her cockpit as the quietest they had ever worked in. Not because she was cold or unapproachable, but because she communicated in exactly the words the situation required and never one beyond that. Nothing wasted, nothing overlooked. Her husband, Kendrick Beaumont, was not a quiet man, and this had been, for years, part of his appeal. He was a commercial real estate developer, 42 years old, the kind of man who filled every room he entered with the broad and practiced energy of someone who had made a career out of convincing other people that his vision was worth their money and their risk. He was genuinely charming, the kind of charming that is not performance but actual temperature, something his body ran at naturally, something you felt when you were near him before he had even opened his mouth. Imara had not been immune to it when they met at a rooftop gathering in Washington, D.C. 13 years ago. He had handed her a drink she hadn't asked for, said something about how she looked like the only person at this party who already had somewhere better to be, and she had laughed before she had time to decide whether she wanted to. She fell in love with him over the following 7 months in the deliberate way she did most things. With full attention, having first examined the situation from multiple angles. They had been good together for a while. She knew that, and she held the knowledge the way you hold a photograph of a place you used to live, not with regret exactly, but with the particular tenderness of something true that has since changed its shape. The distance had come the way it usually does, not in one dramatic rupture but in gradual accumulating degrees. Kendrick's development projects grew larger, which meant his travel grew more frequent, which meant the time between the trips that were explained and the trips that weren't narrowed slowly until she was paying careful attention to the gap. Imara noticed things. This was not unique to her personal life. It was simply how she operated in every environment, the result of years of training that required her to register anomalies and data before they became problems. A reading that shifts by 3 degrees before a storm. A fuel calculation that doesn't match the estimate. A husband whose explanations get shorter in inverse proportion to how often he's away. She did not panic, she observed. 6 weeks before the date of this flight, she had dropped one of Kendrick's blazers at the dry cleaner on Georgia Avenue and found, in the inside bread's pocket, a hotel receipt. Boutique property Charlotte. A Thursday night in March. The date was one she knew well because it was the date Kendrick had told her over dinner the Sunday prior that he had a site walkthrough in Atlanta. She held the receipt for a moment, turned it over, read the room number and the checkout time and the total, which included a minibar charge and a room service order for 2. She put the receipt back in the pocket and dropped the blazer off. She said thank you to the woman at the counter and walked to her car and drove home. When Kendrick arrived 2 days later with a box of pralines he said he'd picked up passing through Buckhead, she accepted them with a genuine smile. They were good pralines. She ate 2 over the course of the evening and said nothing about Charlotte, nothing about the receipt, nothing about the calculation she was now running in the background of every other thing she was doing. Because that was the thing about Imara Osei-Bonsu. She did not move until she knew exactly what she was moving against. The second piece arrived 10 days later through her younger sister, Abena, who was 34 years old and worked in marketing, and possessed the particular gift of noticing human behavior in peripheral spaces, at adjacent tables, across lobbies, in the corners of rooms where people believed themselves unseen. Abena had been at a wine bar in Georgetown on a Friday evening for a friend's birthday and had spotted Kendrick at a corner table with a woman, his hand over her hand on the white linen, his face tilted toward her in the way Imara recognized, the way he angled himself when he wanted someone to feel chosen. Abena had taken a photograph from 2 tables away, with the controlled, careful motion of someone who hopes very much to be wrong. She had sent it to Imara at 9:17 p.m. with no text, no caption, nothing. Just the image. Imara had looked at the photograph for a long time. The woman was 30-something, natural hair, the kind of easy and self-possessed look that didn't require the photo to flatter her. She was laughing at something Kendrick had said. He was watching her laugh with the specific expression of a man who is delighted by the effect he is producing. Imara saved the photograph to a private folder. She locked her phone. She went back to the flight operations manual she had been working through and finished the section she was on. Then she went to bed. When Abena called the next morning, barely containing herself, "You're not going to say anything to him?" "I'm gathering information," Imara said. Imara. His hand was on her hand, at a restaurant in Georgetown. "That is not a business dinner. I know what it is. So I'm gathering information. When I have all of it, I'll know exactly what to do." She paused. "Don't contact him. Don't mention this to anyone. Give me time." Abena exhaled the way she had been exhaling since childhood whenever Imara was being Imara. Long and resigned and ultimately trusting. "Fine," she said, "but I hate this." "I know, thank you for telling me." The third piece was the one that closed the triangle. Imara's airline scheduling access, a standard operational tool for crew management, showed 2 first-class seats booked through Kendrick's corporate travel account on her exact assigned flight, Washington Dulles to Houston Intercontinental, departing Tuesday morning, his name in 1A. In 1B, the booking listed Miss Solange Tremblay, a name that, when she ran it quietly against the face in Abena's photograph, confirmed everything she needed to confirm. She had been scheduled on this flight for 3 weeks. Kendrick did not track her schedule. He had stopped asking about it. She now recognized, approximately 14 months ago, around the time, she could see this now in the kind of clear retroactive way that only becomes available once you know what you're looking for, that something else had started occupying his attention. She called her attorney the evening she found the booking. Priscilla Darko, Howard Law, 11 years in family practice. The kind of woman who completes your sentences because she has already seen where they re-going. They spoke for 32 minutes. By the end of the call, Imara had a clear picture of the next steps and a clear picture of what the outcome would look like, and she felt something she identified, with some precision, as relief. Not happiness, not yet, but relief, the specific sensation of uncertainty resolving into a known quantity you can actually work with. She brewed tea. She reviewed approach procedures for Houston Intercontinental. She went to bed at a reasonable hour and slept without interruption, because she had a flight to prepare for, and she was, above all and always, a professional. In the days that followed, she restructured 2 financial accounts with the calm, specific guidance of Priscilla's office. She assembled documentation. The Charlotte hotel receipt, phone records obtained through proper legal channels, the photograph Abena had taken, a written timeline of inconsistencies compiled with the same meticulous attention she applied to pre-flight checklists. She did each of these things without announcement. She told Abena only that it was being handled. She told no one else anything. And she arranged, through a secure channel within the airline, for one additional thing to be in place when Flight 914 landed at Houston Intercontinental. Not dramatic, not illegal, not anything that could be called revenge in any technical sense. Just information delivered at a time of her choosing, in a manner entirely within her authority as the commanding officer of that aircraft. She had thought carefully about that authority. She had thought about what she owed her profession and her passengers and her own integrity. She had concluded that the truth, stated plainly, on the ground after every professional duty had been discharged completely, was something she was allowed, something she had in fact earned. The Tuesday morning of the flight, Kendrick kissed her on the cheek at 5:50 a.m. He was dressed in travel clothes, his carry-on by the door, his collared shirt open at the top button. He smelled of the amber and cedar cologne. Up close, it was a lot. Early start, he said. Always, she said. She was already in uniform, coffee in hand, flight bag at her feet. I've got a big week. Houston deal is almost closed. I know, you mentioned. He studied her face for a brief moment in the way that people sometimes do when they are looking for something specific and trying not to look like they're looking. Her face gave him nothing except its ordinary self, calm, present, slightly distracted by the morning. I'll call when I land, he said. She said. He picked up his bag and went to the door. He paused there, his hand on the frame, and said, without turning all the way around, You good? I'm always good, Kendrick. He nodded. He left. She listened to the front door close, and then his car start, and then the sound of the engine fading down their street, and she stood in her kitchen in her captain's uniform, with her coffee going cool in her hand, and she allowed herself exactly the amount of feeling she could carry without it spilling into anything that mattered, and then she set the cup down and picked up her flight bag and walked to her own car. She was the first crew member on the aircraft that morning. Kendrick Beaumont arrived at the premium check-in counter at Dulles, with the ease of a man who had done this many times, who regarded airports not as stressful places, but as transitional environments he had learned to navigate efficiently. He wore a charcoal blazer over a cream shirt, no tie, his leather carry-on in the rolling hand that wasn't holding his phone. He was already reading an email about the Houston property when he reached the counter and barely looked up to hand over his documents. Solange Tremblay was beside him. She was 33, a landscape architect based in Silver Spring, a detail that, had anyone been inclined to note the geography, placed her origin precisely 3 miles from where Imara had grown up, a coincidence with no bearing on the story but the kind of specific irony that life occasionally inserts for reasons best known to itself. She had natural hair pulled back with a single clip, the kind of effortless styling that requires genuine confidence in what's underneath. She rolled her own bag and carried her own boarding pass, and held herself with the particular stance of someone who has made a decision they are not completely settled about. On the drive to the airport, she had asked him, Are you sure about this? It's fine, Kendrick had said. You're a consulting contact. If anyone asks, we're reviewing site specifications. That's not what I'm asking. He had glanced at her. Then what are you asking? I'm asking if you're sure. About all of it. About us being in the same city for 4 days. About what this is. Kendrick had navigated the lane change before answering. I'm sure, he said, with the conviction of a man who has decided that confidence is an adequate substitute for certainty. Look, my marriage has been over in every meaningful way for a long time. Imara and I live completely separate lives. She flies, I work. We share a house and a set of utilities. That's what's left. Solange had looked out the passenger window at the highway. She was not naive. She had never been naive, which was precisely why she was sitting with a discomfort she kept not quite naming. She had told herself a version of this story that let her be present for it. She needed Kendrick's version to keep being true. She doesn't know? Solange said. About what? About any of it. About you and me. No, Kendrick said. This was not true, but he believed it was. He had that particular variety of self-assurance that prevents a person from seeing what is directly in front of them. specifically because seeing it would require them to revise the narrative they have been living in. He thought he was careful. He thought he was quiet. He thought the controlled environment of his life left no gaps. He had never met Priscilla Darko. At the first-class lounge, Kendrick ordered a bourbon at 10 in the morning, with the ease of a man for whom this was an ordinary Tuesday. He settled into a leather chair and worked his phone and radiated the broad, self-satisfied energy of someone whose week is beginning exactly according to plan. Solange sat across from him with a sparkling water and said little, scrolling her own phone, present in body and somewhere more complicated in mind. He did not notice the woman in the Navy airline uniform who passed through the lounge corridor 40 yards away. Her captain's hat squarely on, her flight bag over her shoulder, her pace deliberate and unhurried. He had no reason to look up. As far as he knew, Imara was somewhere over the Atlantic on an international rotation she'd mentioned last week. He had not verified this. He did not verify things about Imara's schedule because he had long ago stopped tracking it, having decided that her absence was a condition of their marriage rather than a variable he needed to monitor. This assumption was one of several that were about to be corrected. They boarded through the priority lane. The jetway was clean and cool, and they walked down it side by side, Kendrick holding the boarding passes, Solange slightly behind, and they settled into 1A and 1B with the practiced motions of frequent travelers. The seats were wide and leather, and the cabin smelled of something faintly floral. The pre-departure champagne came quickly. Kendrick accepted his without looking at the flight attendant's face. The flight attendant's name was Theo, and he had worked with Imara on 6 previous flights and had received, from the senior attendant Claudette 30 minutes before boarding, a quiet and comprehensive briefing. He accepted his instructions with the professionalism of someone who understood that unusual situations exist and that his job description had always included the possibility of unusual situations. He poured the champagne and offered warm nuts and smiled at Kendrick Beaumont with absolute neutrality and moved away. Claudette herself was a 14-year veteran with a face that could convey 5 separate things at once while conveying nothing in particular to an observer not trained to read it. She checked the first-class cabin once after boarding was complete, made eye contact with Theo, and went forward to close the cabin. "Full aircraft?" Imara said when Claudette stepped into the cockpit for the pre-departure cabin report. "Yes, Captain. 142 passengers. First class is sold out." Claudette paused at exactly the weight a meaningful pause carries. 1A and 1B are occupied. "I know," Imara said. She was looking at her instrument panel. Claudette said nothing more and went back to the cabin. Imara's first officer that morning was Faye Ashworth, 27 years old, 2 years into her first officer position, sharp and competent, and currently the only person on this aircraft who had been told nothing beyond the standard operational information. Faye ran through the pre-departure checklist with Imara in the clean, efficient rhythm of 2 professionals who had flown together several times and knew each other's cadence. They verified every item. They confirmed every reading. Their voices were level and specific and economical. At one point, Faye looked up from her panel and said, "You seem focused this morning." Imara said, "I'm always focused." Faye returned to her checklist. "Right, obviously. Sorry, don't apologize. Just keep going." The pushback was authorized at 10:08 a.m. The aircraft moved backward from the gate with the slow, massive deliberateness of something that has no interest in being rushed, and Imara felt it the way she always felt it. The slight shift, the ground crew disconnecting, the aircraft becoming briefly and entirely in her care. She loved this moment. She had always loved this moment. The transition from stationary to moving, from earth to eventual sky. What was sitting in her chest she did not name. She held it the way she held everything she could not address yet, with a firm internal grip that left her hands completely free for the work in front of her. They taxied, they received their takeoff clearance. They lined up on the runway. And then Imara pushed the throttles forward, and Flight 914 accelerated down the pavement and lifted, smoothly and on schedule, into the Virginia morning. Behind the cockpit door, in seat 1A, Kendrick Beaumont tilted his champagne flute towards Solange and said, "Here we go." She lifted her glass and touched it to his. "Here we go," she said. The aircraft climbed through the first layer of cloud and broke into clear sky. Above it, and Imara leveled off and trimmed the aircraft and set the heading for Houston, and the world below disappeared into white, and above it was only that specific unreachable blue. 2 hours into the flight, Claudette came to the cockpit door and knocked in the private sequence reserved for personal communications with the captain. Imara opened it 3 inches. "He sent a note," Claudette said. Her voice was barely a murmur. She held out a folded cocktail napkin. Imara didn't take it immediately. "What kind of note?" "The romantic kind, addressed to the pilot. He doesn't know who's flying." Claudette's face was doing something that under any other circumstances would be funny. He introduced himself as 1A and asked if the pilots were taking requests for a smooth ride. Imara took the napkin. "Read it." It said, in Kendrick's unmistakable casual scrawl. "Hey up there, 1A here. Some of us back here are celebrating. Any chance of a glass-smooth flight all the way into Houston? Would be much appreciated. Having the kind of day that deserves it." She folded it back along its crease. She held it for a moment in her palm. "Tell him," she said, "that the captain says clear skies ahead. Glass smooth. Promise." Claudette received the napkin back. She nodded once. She pulled the cockpit door shut. Faye, who had heard nothing, made a small notation on her pad and said, "Reaching top of descent in about 40 minutes, Captain." "Copy that," Mara said. "I'll take the approach." "You always take the approach," Faye observed. Said Imara, which was not a disagreement. She looked out the windshield at the open sky ahead, at the particular quality of light at cruise altitude, at the absolute stillness of the blue that existed up here and nowhere else. She had been given a great deal in her life, her father's example, her mother's persistence. 11 years of finding out, repeatedly and in various conditions, that she was capable of more than the previous situation had required of her. She had been given, somewhere along the way, the specific mercy of knowing exactly who she was, and she had been given the understanding, harder won than any certification, that knowing who you are is the thing that cannot be taken from you, no matter what anyone boarding one of your flights chooses to do with their Tuesday. She was aware of him back there. She was aware of the other woman back there. She felt the weight of it the same way she felt the weight of the aircraft. Not as a burden exactly, information. Data. Something she was accountable for managing until the right moment arrived. She held it. She flew. 38,000 feet. Glass smooth. Promise kept. The Texas coast came in from the southeast the way it always does. Flat and vast and threaded with the silver of bayous catching the afternoon light. The city of Houston spread itself across the plain with its particular unbothered sprawl, and the visibility was unrestricted, perfect, clear, the kind of approach day that asks nothing extra of a pilot and offers everything in return. Imara called for the descent checklist at the appropriate marker. Faye read every item. They worked through it without ceremony, without pause, without a single item left unverified. Imara took the aircraft down through 20,000 feet, then 15, then 10, and the city resolved from geometry into detail. Rooftops and highway interchanges and the specific brown-green of Texas vegetation caught between seasons. ATC cleared her for the approach. She configured the aircraft at the correct altitudes, called each configuration change to Faye, set the glide path, and brought Flight 914 down through its final miles toward Houston Intercontinental with complete and unremarkable precision. In Seat 1A, Kendrick Beaumont had finished his second bourbon and was in a deeply good mood. The flight had been everything his note had asked for. Smooth, comfortable, the altitude doing what altitude does to trouble, which is make it feel very small and very far below. He felt good about the Houston deal. He felt good about the week ahead. He felt, in the specific and unfortunate way of men who have talked themselves into a story, that everything was manageable. He reached over and rested his hand on Solange's forearm. She was looking out the window at Texas coming up beneath them. She let his hand stay. "Happy," he said. She turned from the window and looked at him. Something in her face was doing quiet arithmetic, a calculation she wasn't ready to share yet. "Ask me in a few days," she said. "Fair enough," Kendrick said, and squeezed her arm once and sat back. The wheels touched the runway in a single clean contact, the kind of landing that produces no drama, no bounce, no sidestep, just the immediate solid certainty of a machine exactly where it is supposed to be. The aircraft rolled out and slowed and turned off the runway onto the taxiway, and the Houston afternoon began pressing itself against the windows in warmth and haze. Kendrick straightened his blazer, looked at his phone to check the time, thought about the drive to the hotel, about the dinner reservation he'd made at a place on Post Oak that had been recommended by a colleague, about the first meeting of the deal tomorrow morning. And then the intercom opened. Not the two-tone chime of a routine cabin announcement. The channel opened to every corner of that aircraft, every seat, every overhead speaker, the full interior, and a voice came through. A voice that was even and unhurried and carried the particular weight of someone who has been authorized to speak and knows exactly what they intend to say. Kendrick Beaumont heard it the same way every other passenger on Flight 914 heard it, which is to say without warning and without the ability to be anywhere other than exactly where he was. Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. We have arrived at Houston Intercontinental Airport. The local time is 12:43 in the afternoon. The weather outside is 81 degrees and clear. On behalf of First Officer Ashworth and our complete cabin crew, thank you for choosing to fly with us today. Standard, professional, unremarkable. Before we finish, I'm going to take a brief personal moment, which I ask your patience for. A single breath of pause. To the passenger in seat 1A, Kendrick, this is Imara, your wife. I have been your pilot today, and I want you to know that every single person on this aircraft has been completely safe in my hands because that is my job, and I do my job regardless of what is happening in my personal life. That has always been true. I imagine it has been convenient for you. In 1A, Kendrick Beaumont's hand went still on his phone. The accounts have been separated. The house locks are being changed this evening. Priscilla Darko's office will be in touch with your attorney this week. She has all of the documentation she needs, and she is very thorough. You'll find your belongings are still at the house, packed neatly in the guest room. Another breath. I want you to have a productive week in Houston. I genuinely hope the deal closes well. One final pause, and the voice that came through next was exactly the same as it had been from the first word. Even, unhurried, fully in possession of itself. For everyone else on board, thank you for your grace and your patience. Please watch your step as you exit. We hope to see you in the air again soon. The intercom closed. The cabin of Flight 914 was silent for approximately 4 full seconds. 4 seconds in which 142 people processed the same audio and arrived at their individual understandings of what had just occurred. Then from somewhere in the middle of economy, a woman said quietly but clearly, "Oh, she did not." Someone in row 14 laughed, not unkindly, just the involuntary release of someone surprised by the specific turn life had just taken. And then, starting from the back and building forward with the organic, authentic momentum of people who are responding to something that has moved them without fully being able to say why, the applause came. Not the polite patter of a smooth landing. Something with actual feeling in it. Something that sounded like recognition. In seat 1A, Kendrick had not moved. The bourbon glass was in his hand, slightly tilted, as if his arm had received the message from his brain a half-second late. His face moved through several things in rapid, uncontrolled succession. Confusion first, then a flash of something that wanted to be anger. Then, and this was the thing that would stay with him longer than any of the others, a specific and crushing clarity. The kind of clarity that arrives all at once and rearranges everything you thought you understood about a situation you believed you had handled carefully. She had known. She had known before the flight. She had been in that cockpit. She had served him his notes answer through a flight attendant. She had brought this aircraft down smooth and clean while carrying everything she was carrying. And then she had waited until the wheels were on the ground and every professional obligation had been fully met. And then she had spoken. In 1B, Solange Tremblay had gone very still. Her water glass was set on the tray table with a precision that suggested her hands needed something to do that wasn't visible. She was looking at the seat back directly in front of her, and she was thinking about the question she had asked in the car, "And your wife?" And about the answer she had been given, and about how much of the last 7 months she had spent in the deliberate comfort of not pressing too hard on that answer. She was also thinking about the phrase Kendrick had used. Imara lives in the cockpit. Literally and figuratively, he'd said. She heard those words differently now. She heard the contempt that had been living inside them, the casual reduction of a woman's excellence into a flaw. She thought about the pilot who had just spoken through that intercom, even, composed, precise, and she thought, that is not a woman who lives in the cockpit because she has nothing else. That is a woman who is so completely herself that the people around her cannot see it for what it is. She reached up and opened the overhead bin. She pulled down her carry-on. She clicked the handle up. Kendrick looked at her. "Don't," she said, not harshly, not with any particular volume, just with the finality of a word chosen carefully. "I need you to not talk to me right now. I can explain." Kendrick. She turned and looked at him fully, and whatever was in her expression was not anger. It was something quieter and more complete than that. She flew the whole flight. She sat up there and flew the whole flight, and she didn't say one word until she was on the ground and her job was done. She picked up her bag. I have been making excuses for months because I needed to. I don't need to anymore. She moved to the aisle. She did not look back. Kendrick sat in seat 1A while the cabin emptied around him in the unhurried, bag-shuffling way of people who have a place to be. The retired couple in row 2 passed his row without looking at him. A businessman from 1B across the aisle gave him a brief, sidelong glance with no readable emotion in it. Theo moved through the first-class cabin collecting glasses and napkins and did not make eye contact with 1A once. When the forward section was almost clear, a woman, somewhere in her 50s, traveling alone, the kind of compact and self-possessed traveler who needs nothing from anyone, paused at the end of Kendrick's row. He became aware of her presence and looked up. She didn't say anything. She just looked at him for a moment with an expression that contained, somehow, both pity and an absolute absence of sympathy. Then she moved toward the door. Kendrick got up when the gate agent came to ask him politely if he needed assistance deplaning. He collected his bag from the overhead. He walked up the jetway into the wide, air-conditioned indifference of Houston Intercontinental, and he stood for a moment in the terminal with travelers parting around him like water around a stopped thing, and he tried to identify what he was feeling. It wasn't anger. He had expected anger and found it wasn't available. It was something that had the weight of being known, of being seen, completely and at range, by someone who had assembled the full picture before he was even aware the picture was being assembled. He thought about Imara at 5:50 that morning in her captain's uniform, coffee in hand, face carrying nothing, saying, "I'm always good, Kendrick." He thought about how long she must have been planning, how many days she had gotten up and flown her flights, and come home and sat across from him at dinner or passed him in the hallway and known, while carrying it, while managing it, while arranging every piece exactly where it needed to go before she moved. That was the thing. That had always been the thing. He had called it absence. He had called it emotional unavailability. He had told himself the story of a woman too married to her career to be present in her marriage, and he had used that story to justify every choice he'd made in the last 14 months. But the woman who had just spoken through that intercom was not absent. She was not unavailable. She had been, in fact, the most present person in the entire sequence of events, present to every piece of information, present to every decision, present to her passengers at 38,000 feet, while holding something that would have dismantled most people, and present enough to know exactly when and how to close it out. He had not been in a marriage with a woman who was checked out. He had been in a marriage with a woman who expected him to be what she was, and he had not been able to meet it, and rather than say so honestly, he had found a way to make her the reason. He walked toward the exit. His phone showed 11 notifications. He put it in his blazer pocket without reading any of them and kept walking. Imara finished the post-flight paperwork with Faye, who had processed the events of the last 20 minutes in the private, conscientious way of a young professional trying to figure out what her response should be and landing on. "Not my business. Stay focused. Admire from a careful distance." When the paperwork was complete and Faye had gathered her things, she paused at the cockpit door. "Captain," she said, not asking anything, just acknowledging. "Get some rest, Faye," Imara said. "Good flight." "Yes, ma'am. You too." Faye left. Claudette appeared a moment later in the now quiet cockpit doorway. "He deplaned," Claudette said. "The woman in 1B left first. They did not leave together." Imara nodded. She was completing the last line of her log. "The cabin gave you a round," Claudette added, "in case you didn't hear." "I heard," Imara said. She set down her pen and looked at Claudette, this woman who had poured water for her on overnight transatlantics and covered a scheduling discrepancy once without being asked, and brought her the napkin today without making it about herself. "Thank you, Claudette, for all of it, for everything today." Claudette held her gaze for a moment. "You would have done the same for any of ours," she said. Imara accepted this. She stood, collected her bag, put on her hat, and walked off the aircraft into the Houston afternoon. Her phone produced a cascade of messages the moment the airplane mode restriction lifted. Abena, who had a gift for knowing things the moment they happened, had sent 8 messages and was calling. Imara let it ring twice, then answered. "Is it real?" Abena said without preamble. "Did you actually?" "Yes." A sound from Abena's end that was part exhale, part something closer to joy. "Imara, I have been sitting here all morning refreshing my phone." "I know." How do you feel? Imara stood outside the terminal in the Houston heat, her rolling bag beside her, the afternoon sun cutting hard across the concrete. She considered the question with her standard precision. I feel like someone who finished a job, she said. I'll feel other things later. That is so you, Abina said, laughing with tears in her voice. I'm going to get to my hotel. I have a turnaround Thursday morning. Imara, please. Can you feel a feeling for 5 minutes? I am feeling things. Abina, I'm just doing it on my own schedule. She flagged a cab. I'll call you tonight. Tell no one anything until I say so. Not yet, okay? I love you. I know. Love you too. She gave the driver the hotel name and sat back in the cab and watched Houston move past the windows. All that. Flat, enormous, unimpressed Texas geography. And she did not perform anything for the cab driver or for the phone or for the idea of anyone watching. She was quiet with what she was carrying, which was substantial, and she was honest with herself in the privacy of that cab about what came next. The house, the accounts, the eventual unraveling of a life shared, which is never clean no matter how carefully you manage it, no matter how much documentation Priscilla Darko assembles. There were years in there. There were good years. There was a man she had loved genuinely. For real, before the years wore the shape of things into something she didn't recognize anymore. She let herself feel that in the cab, without explaining it to anyone, just for a few minutes, just for however long the drive took. At the hotel, she showered. She ordered room service, a real meal, something with vegetables and actual effort behind it. She called Abina back and talked for an hour, the kind of long, looping conversation that doesn't solve anything but moves things, loosens things, lets them occupy different positions than they had before. She did not cry during the call, but she did laugh 3 times, genuinely, and that felt like something. She reviewed the flight plan for Thursday's early departure before she slept. She set her alarm for 5:15. She turned off the lamp and lay in the cool hotel dark and breathed in and breathed out and let the day settle. She slept 7 hours. Exactly. In the weeks that followed, a recording from someone in economy, just the audio of the intercom announcement, 38 seconds, moved through the internet with the particular velocity reserved for things that hit a nerve people didn't know they had. By Wednesday, it had reached several 100,000 shares. By the weekend, the number was larger and growing. Comment sections filled with debates about professional boundaries and personal autonomy and the nature of self-possession in public spaces. Journalists called the airline. The airline issued a brief statement about respecting crew privacy. People argued, as they always do. The comments that returned to most often were not from people who approved or disapproved on principle. They were from people who had listened to the recording twice, 3 times, 4 times, and landed on some version of the same specific observation. She was so calm, the whole time. You can hear it. She is so completely herself. Imara did not read the comments. She was not on social media in any public way and had no intention of becoming so. She flew her Thursday morning departure on time. She flew a Friday afternoon turnaround. She picked up an extra weekend leg because a colleague was sick. She did what she did, as she had always done it, which was the right thing in the right order until all the pieces were where they belonged. Kendrick reached out once, through Priscilla's office, requesting a conversation before proceeding with the formal filings. Priscilla conveyed the message. Imara thought about it for one day, decided she had said the essential things and did not need to say them again, and asked Priscilla to proceed. The proceedings moved with the efficiency that comes from clear documentation, a competent attorney, and no assets whose ownership was genuinely ambiguous. Priscilla Darko's thoroughness was, as advertised, extraordinary. Solange Tremblay sent Imara one message, 3 weeks after the flight. She had gotten her contact information through the airline's public inquiry form. It said, I don't expect you to respond to this. I just need to say I'm sorry. Not for what I owe you, though I owe it, but because you deserve better than to be made invisible by someone you gave everything to. I see that now. I should have seen it sooner. She did not ask for forgiveness. She did not offer explanations. She just said the thing and closed it. Imara read it twice. She thought about the woman in seat 1B who had stood up on that plane and taken her own bag from the overhead bin and walked off without looking back. She thought about how much effort it requires sometimes to move toward truth when staying in the comfortable version is so much easier. She did not respond. But she saved the message in the same folder where she kept the Charlotte hotel receipt and the documentation and Abena's photograph because it was a true thing and she had always kept true things. 4 months after Flight 914, on a clear October morning, Imara Osibansu walked to the gate at Dulles for a 7:45 a.m. departure Denver, and a member of the ground crew, a man named Darnell, who had been working the airfield for 22 years, looked up from his clipboard as she approached and gave her the kind of nod that doesn't require any words underneath it. She nodded back. She put on her hat. She climbed the stairs. She walked to the front of the aircraft and sat down and strapped in and ran the checklist with her first officer, clean and precise and exactly sufficient, and the cockpit was quiet in the way her cockpits had always been quiet. At 7:45 a.m. on the dot, Flight 289 pushed back from the gate. The aircraft lifted off the runway and climbed through the low Virginia clouds and broke into the sky above them, and Imara leveled off at cruise altitude and looked through the windshield at the wide and unreachable blue, the specific shade that lives only up here and nowhere else, the shade she had loved since she was 19 years old, and alone in a small plane over the Maryland countryside, becoming for the first time fully and irrevocably herself. She looked at it now the same way she always had, like it was home, like it was the truest address she'd ever had. Below her, everything continued, everything sorted itself, in the patient and eventual way that things do sort themselves, into what it was going to be. Above it, without performance, without audience, without needing anything from the altitude except the altitude itself, Captain Imara Osibansu flew. There is a particular kind of person the world has not yet developed good language for. Not the loudest one in the room, not the one who fights in real time, not the one who sends the angry text at midnight or makes the dramatic phone call from the parking lot. The world has plenty of language for those expressions. What we do not have enough words for is the person who sees the full picture, holds it without cracking, prepares without announcing, and acts. When they act, with the complete authority of someone who has done every single thing that was their responsibility to do first. Imara Osibansu is that person. And the first lesson of this story is that we should stop confusing that kind of person with someone who doesn't feel things. She felt everything. The cologne in the galley, the receipt in the blazer pocket, the photograph Abina took in a Georgetown wine bar on a Friday night. She felt the accumulated weight of a marriage going quiet in the wrong ways, of explanations getting thinner, of a man who had decided that her capability was the problem rather than the gift it was. She felt all of it, completely, in her body and in her chest, and she chose, with full awareness and full agency, not to let it exit through any channel that would compromise her integrity, harm her passengers, or give her opponent the map of her position before she was ready to move. That is not coldness. That is not absence. That is not emotional unavailability. That is a discipline that most of us will never be called upon to exercise at that level, and it deserves to be named for what it is, an extraordinary act of self-possession. The second thing this story asks us to hold is the danger of rewriting another person's excellence as a personal failing. Kendrick did not fall into dishonesty because Imara was a bad wife. He fell into it because it was easier to make her the reason than to examine what he actually was and was not. The story he told, she lives in the cockpit, she's not really present, she takes up too much space, is the kind of story people tell when they need the other person to be less than they are. When your own choices need a justification, and the person you're with simply refuses to be small enough to provide one. If someone is calling your competence your flaw, if your professionalism is being described as your unavailability, if the thing you have worked hardest to become is being held up as the reason someone else felt entitled to look elsewhere, that is not a critique worth accepting. That is a story being told by someone who needed you to be smaller and couldn't make you smaller and found another way. The third lesson is about timing. Not every truth needs to be said the moment it becomes available to you. There is a difference between silence as defeat and silence as strategy. Imara's silence was never surrender, it was assembly. Every piece in its right place, every step taken in the correct order. The truth spoken finally, at the exact moment she had earned the right to speak it and not 1 second before. And when she spoke, she was on the ground. Her passengers were safe. Her job was done. She had been everything her profession required of her before she was anything her personal life needed her to be. That is not the behavior of a woman who has been living in the cockpit to escape her marriage. That is the behavior of a woman who understands at a fundamental level what she owes the world and what the world owes her. Do your work first, all of it, completely. And then, when the wheels are down and the passengers are safe and you have discharged every obligation that was yours to Discharge, then speak, then move. Then let the record show exactly who you were the whole time. The sky, for Imara Osei, was never a place to hide. It was the place where she was most completely herself. There is no higher altitude than that.